Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our latest installment of the Catskill Mountain Foundation and the Academy of Fortepiano Performance's International Fortepiano Salon online. My name is Yiheng Yang. I'm a forte pianist and I'm living in New York City, and that's where I'm visiting with you from this afternoon. I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Maria Rose, who is in upstate New York. Welcome. And as I say to our audience, if you're new this time, and for those returning, please, at this moment, we would love to know where you are and who you are. So in the chat box of your YouTube or Facebook live stream, please say hello and say where you're watching from right now. We are so privileged to connect with each other right now through the internet. And for a brief hour on this Sunday afternoon, remind each other of why we love music, why we love early pianos. Ever more so than ever in these very complicated and challenging and often sorrowful times, it is ever more important to connect through music and what we have in common. And today we have a wonderful episode on salons in the 18th century and are joined by some truly remarkable guests, Rebecca Cypus and Marcia Hadjimarkos. So before we introduce them properly and hear from them in music and in discussion, I'll let Maria Rose say hello and give you a few announcements. Welcome.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome also from upstate New York, where I am looking at a very gray sky, but it's, and you know, Yiheng, I don't know if I just found out that tomorrow is the second anniversary of our very first salon, and we have been doing this already for 2 years.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah,
well,
amazing. And
for those of you who have,
I really want to thank the Catskill Mountain Foundation for keeping us engaged and really encouraging us to continue this way of connecting with people, not only in our own environments, but really all over the world. And today we're following that tradition. We always have kind of a mix of performances and historical perspectives and thoughts and ideas. And today will be no different. So before we go to our first guest, I would like to just mention that we have a lot of things coming up. First of all, the next salon in March, please stay tuned for that. We'll have a very interesting salon focused on a very unique 18th century genre, namely the accompanied keyboard music. And this will be guest hosted by our good friend Pierre Roy in Switzerland. So again, we'll be battling the time zones, and it's just around the time when some of them change back to summertime. So we'll have to make sure we'll give you the right time. And then this summer we have another academy where we have some wonderful guests, and Andrew Willis, our faithful follower of the salon, will be a guest faculty, and he will be performing and teaching at the workshop in early June, late May, early June. So check our website for the Academy Fortepiano for that information. And we have some wonderful other guests. Robert Levin is going to do a lecture presentation performance on Mozart improvisation and reconstruction. And we have Keiko Shichie. I know you know
Shichijo, Keiko Shichijo. Yeah.
Shichio. And she will be coming. I will learn before she comes. Anyway, she's going to perform and give a masterclass, and we're really looking forward to that too. And not only that, but we're doing a whole new thing that we hope people will come and enjoy, which is a workshop for singers and pianists in the early 19th century and late 18th century lead repertoire. And we have a wonderful faculty member Du Minter from my hometown of Stonebridge in the Catskills. He is, anybody who has listened to Baroque operas will be well familiar with his name. He's had a long career. So we've got a lot going on, but for now, let's go back and welcome our guests for today. Yeah, would you like to introduce?
Oh, yes. Forgive me for the silent pause. It's my great pleasure now to bring onto the stage virtually Rebecca Cypus. Rebecca is Associate Dean at Rutgers University at the Mason Gross School of the Arts, and also one of my musical duo partners. We have lots of fun playing harpsichord and piano duos, and in the opening credits of this video, you heard just a few seconds from one of our albums from a few years back called Sisters Face to Face, and where we play harpsichord and fortepiano combination duets. Rebecca has just come out with a wonderful, fascinating book called Women and Musical Salons in the Enlightenment. It's a wonderful history of salons. And today she will be touching upon salon culture and the culture of play. So Rebecca, welcome. I might also add she's a director of the Raritan Players, of which I am a member. It's a merry band of period instrumentalists of various ensemble formations who do very interesting concerts in the New York City and New Jersey area. So Rebecca is a wonderful colleague, and it's a real joy to welcome you. Hello, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ihang. Thank you so much to you and Maria. It's really an honor to be here. So I'd like to share some of the ideas from my recent and ongoing work on women and musical salons in the 18th century. I first turned to the study of salons in 2014 when I was working with a colleague here at Rutgers in the history department on a project related to Sarah Levy, a Jewish woman in Berlin who was a student of Wilhelm Friedemann Bach and who also hosted a salon. Following that project, I expanded the work that I was doing on salons, and I've recently published the book that Ihang just showed you that foregrounds performance as a component of research. I've also worked along some fantastic collaborators, including Ihang, to produce 3 recordings to date that feature salon performance practices. And so in all of this work, my objective is to treat the women at the center of 18th century salon culture on their own terms, viewing salons as liminal spaces situated between the public and private spheres in which women could exercise cultural agency and assert their musical tastes and talents. And I center their acts of performance as one of the many forms of musicking that took place in the salon. Other forms might be patronage, collection of scores, performance, and other forms of collaboration. I also think that performance can be a means of understanding these women's experiences and their goals and ideals. I don't claim, of course, that my experiences in performance in the 21st century are identical to those of 18th century salon women, nor should they be. But I do think that there have been some practical puzzles that I've encountered in this project that can enrich an understanding of the artistic and affective and ludic or playful qualities of their experiences. So today I'd like to focus on the analogies between musical performance practices and the actual games that were played there, including the game of chess, still familiar to most of us today, and also other games like Proverbs, which is now little known, but which actually played a significant role in some salon gatherings in the 18th century. Musical salons were home to what has sometimes been called adaptive performance practices. That's a phrase used by musicologist Laurie Strauss to relate to 16th century music, but I think the phrase adaptive performance practices applies here as well. What that means is that musical salon performance practices were dependent upon the circle of friends who gathered to enact them, which meant that they had to be constantly adapted. So music making within the salon was a participatory act, and it required individuals to temper their needs in pursuit of social harmony, this ideal of harmony. And this musical metaphor of harmony was enacted through the music itself. It is a truism, everyone will understand readily, that before the age of recorded sound, musical experiences depended on the players who participated and the instruments that they used. So within salons, where music making could be either well-planned or a spur-of-the-moment activity, much depended on who was present on any given evening. So the music historian Charles Burney made this point clear when he visited the salon of Madame Brion in 1770. Brion first played some of her own compositions, and then she sight-read some of Burney's. And here's what Burney reported. She played the second of my sonatas very well at sight on the pianoforte, accompanied by Monsieur Pagin, who was a violinist. And for want of a violoncello, I played that part on the harpsichord. So this kind of adaptation from one medium to the next, you can sort of see, oh, we didn't have a cello, so we substituted the bass line on the harpsichord. The fact that Benjamin Franklin gave Madame Brion a glass harmonica and described in a fanciful story playing it with her in heaven indicates that that glass harmonica was used in her salon. Yet no works calling for the harmonica survive in her collection, which means that the instrument was probably added to other works in unnotated and maybe in spontaneous ways. Similarly, when Mariana Martinez in Vienna performed a pair of her arias for Charles Burney, she did so without the aid of other instruments, but merely by accompanying herself on the harpsichord. None of her compositions survive with just a solo harpsichord accompaniment. She used strings in most cases, and also sometimes oboes and flutes. And that suggests that in Burney's company, she may have reduced the score at sight. The unique collection of instruments used in another salon, that of Anne Ford, included violin, viola da gamba, flute, theorbo, lute, harpsichord, violin, Spanish guitar, and viola d'amore, suggests that the adaptation of music to suit those instruments must have been quite normal. So she's arranging instruments for this very distinctive collection. Sorry, she's arranging musical compositions for this very distinctive collection of instruments that she used in her salon with her friends and colleagues. So from one side, these reconfiguration of instruments were simply a matter of practical necessity because they lacked, right, the salon might have lacked the correct instrumentation among those who visited. But seen from another angle, the fluid nature of salons meant that personnel was constantly shifting, and therefore the realization of music in salons was highly variable. In an age when instrumentation and timbre were in constant flux from one social situation to another, these parameters of performance were necessarily unstable. So adaptive performance practices, such as changing the instrumentation, meant that each musical experience could be unique and uniquely tied to the salon from which it emerged. In some cases, variations in instrumentation were notated with part books copied out for distribution to the various players. It's likely that the performances of Marie-Emmanuelle Bayon's opera Fleur d'Épine at the soirée that she attended with the composer herself as a participant were executed in arrangements, a number of which are preserved in manuscript or in published versions. Sarah Levy's collection of manuscript part books used in her salon includes numerous arrangements, including a unique version, as you see here, of the sonata in E-flat major attributed to J.S. Bach, BWV 1031. Generally known in the scoring for flute and obbligato keyboard, the arrangement in Levy's collection takes the obbligato right-hand part away from the keyboardist and assigns it to the violinist instead. And this meant that the keyboardist's right hand was free to realize a chordal basso continuo, thorough bass, or a more complex contrapuntal line. In other instances, there is evidence to suggest that Levy and other salon participants adapted compositions through unnotated arrangements. So for example, should we listen? We'll listen to a little audio here. Sorry. Sarah Levy and her sisters also played J.S. Bach's 6 organ trios, BWV 525 to 530, in arrangements for 2 non-organ keyboard instruments. When played on the organ, each of these 2 treble lines is executed by one of the organist's hands, while the bass line is played by the feet on the pedals. In the arrangement for keyboard duo, the 2 treble lines are taken by the right hands of the 2 keyboardists. So one of them takes the top line, the other takes the alto line, and the bass line is played by both keyboardists' left hands in unison. While this type of arrangement can be executed on any 2 keyboard instruments, the fortepiano harpsichord combination is known to have been used in Levy's Salon, and it offers a means of simulating the distinctive voices and timbres available on the organ, but in an instrumentation that reflects the Salon context. There was no organ in Levy's Salon, but she did possess multiple stringed keyboard instruments. So let's take a quick listen here. While it was Levy's sister, Fanny von Arnstein, who owned this piece in the arrangement for two non-organ keyboard instruments, Levy herself owned the organ trio full score, meaning that she is likely to have extracted the part for the keyboard duo by reading from the score. It's precisely this sort of extemporaneous realization that would have been at home in the playful environment of the Salon. In the absence of notated part books, the musicians would have adapted the notated music on the spur of the moment, accommodating the score to the medium of performance. When used for the first time, such a process might well have led to confusion or embarrassment, but those were experiences that were part of the process of sight reading in the late 18th century. This spur-of-the-moment adaptation of musical compositions has much in common with games that were often played in salons. One such game that bears much in common with this process of creating off-the-cuff arrangements is this image that you'll see in just a moment, the Sonderbares musikalisches Stück, the playful musical game shown in this illustration. The composer here is Johann Schobert, who identifies himself as the musicus of the Prince de Conti, but was also closely connected to other salons. This page, it's just a single page, offers musicians a means to fill their time through musical play and sociability. The piece, Schobert explains, can be played on the clavier, the violin, and the bass in a variety of ways. The 5 short minuets on the page use the same basic material, but each requires experimentation on the part of the players in order to unravel the riddle or the puzzle of their execution. So Minuet 1 can be read identically upside down and right side up, meaning that if 2 players are sitting across from each other at a table and they're playing violins or a flute or flutes, they could read from the same page, but still play in unison. In Minuet 2, the same seating yields 2 distinct treble parts and 2 distinct bass parts, but they all harmonize with each other. Reading the music in company among friends and solving the puzzle of each of these minuets yields a distinctive sort of sociable experience. This musical game, which sets players across from one another as they read from the score, serves a similar function to instruments like this one, a double keyboard that was used by 2 players at a time to play keyboard duets. So this is a single instrument with 2 keyboards and the 2 players face one another. This was known as a vis-a-vis or face-to-face keyboard. As a material artifact of a lived experience, it denotes visual as well as oral communication, right? The 2 ladies here are looking at each other as well as playing together. This musical sociability is also fostered by objects such as the quartet tables of the 18th century, around which 4 musicians would arrange themselves for maximum visual interaction. These objects resonate with the iconography of 18th century salons as well. So this image shows a performance that could well have taken place in a salon gathering. The musicians arrange themselves around the female keyboardist who serves to bind them together, and their listeners sit or stand just opposite. The 18th century saw the publication and practice of a number of musical games, including dice games, that enabled someone not highly trained in composition to compose through a highly constrained set of aleatoric or chance-based means, sometimes framed as a system appropriate for professional composers and sometimes just as a pastime for amateurs. Dice games called into question the whole idea of expertise, placing composition within the domain of the untutored amateur. Through play, such creative acts became a polite enterprise, one available even to upper-class women, precisely because of their apparent and paradoxical ease. Outside of music, too, games often figured in proceedings of salons. So Madame Brillon and Benjamin Franklin, played chess regularly, as Franklin explained to the American diplomat William Carmichael in a letter of 1780. He said, "With her daughters who sing prettily and some friends who play, she kindly entertains me and my grandson with little concerts, a dish of tea, and a game of chess. I call this my opera, for I rarely go to the opera at Paris." The juxtaposition of music and chess in Madame Brillon's salon is instructive. 2 years before Franklin wrote this letter to William Carmichael, Franklin had composed an essay titled "The Morals of Chess," in which he expounded on the game's capacity to foster sociability. He begins the essay with the claim that Chess is not merely an idle amusement. Several valuable qualities of the mind useful in the course of human life are to be acquired or strengthened by it so as to become habits ready on all occasions. And he goes on at length about these qualities, which include foresight, circumspection, caution, perseverance, offering practical advice on each that could easily be applied to life more generally. In closing, however, Franklin refers to a more sociable, polite form of chess, in which a player's opponent becomes more a friend than a foe. And here's what he says. If the game is not to be played rigorously according to the rules above mentioned, right, all the rules that he's just spent a whole pamphlet's worth of pages explaining, then moderate your desire of victory over your adversary and be pleased with one over yourself. Snatch not eagerly at every advantage offered by his unskillfulness or inattention, but point out to him kindly that by such a move he places or leaves a piece in danger and unsupported, and that by another he will put his king in a dangerous situation, etc. By this generous civility, so opposite to the unfairness above forbidden, you may indeed happen to lose the game to your opponent, but you will win what is better, his esteem, his respect, his affection, together with the silent approbation and goodwill of impartial spectators. Like the keyboardist in four-hand compositions or two keyboard compositions, Franklin's ideal sociable chess player presents a generous civility that suppresses selfish inclinations in favor of the success of a friend. Another episode in which games were juxtaposed with music was in the musical Salon of the Comtesse de Genlis, Madame Genlis, during the winter of 1767. As in Franklin's account of his evenings chez Brion, Genlis allowed musical and non-musical games to allied in her description, and she later recalled, "We not only played proverbs, but also performed a comic opera for which my friend, Mademoiselle Bayon, composed the music." The game of proverbs could be played in numerous ways. This was such an interesting rabbit hole to dive down, and I have so many things to say about proverbs, but it involved generally learning witty or edifying proverbs and either acting them out silently or giving spoken hints or even improvising songs on the theme of the proverb until the other players guessed it. So it could be thought of like the game of taboo, if you know that one. Genlis, who was also a governess, explained the game of proverbs further in her treatise on education, where she wrote, "I intend to make the children play proverbs all this winter. For this purpose, it is necessary to be able to compose them extempore, to give them an instructive and moral cast, and to play them with propriety. This amusement is equally agreeable and instructive when it assumes a moral complexion. It teaches to speak with collectedness and propriety, and gives a considerable command of language and style." The game of proverbs for Genlis was both amusing and instructive. It focused rhetorical fluency by forcing students to speak extemporaneously. In encouraging engagement with moral proverbs, the game was equally instructive for its players' characters, right? Their sort of social deportment. In her account of her Salon in 1767, music, theater, and the game of proverbs intertwined to create an experience that may be understood from the perspective of this same two-part effect. So it combined entertainment with edification or education. Indeed, musical play within salons is instructive in a similar fashion. In the act of attempting to realize a piece with the instruments and personnel who were present on a given evening, participants learned to listen to and accommodate one another with the goal of solving a puzzle, that is, creating music that enacts a pleasing harmony and reciprocity. So for Yihang and me, fortepiano harpsichord duets constitute, I think, a similar kind of puzzle. And Yihang, you could chime in later if you'd like. One aspect of this phenomenon was purely practical. So in setting up our instruments face to face, as you see in this picture, we found that it was easier to hear the other player than it was ourselves. So when I practiced alone, I heard only my treble line, but when I combined my part with Yihang's part, the soundboard of her instrument was right beside my ear, which meant that the notes she was playing resonated more strongly and audibly than my own. Another result of this experimentation with keyboard duo practices was the realization that the trio texture began to feel bare. So Yihang and I began to realize harmonies for some of this music through the introduction of improvised inner voices, essentially playing basso continuo to accompany ourselves. And this became the next step in solving our puzzle. So we set out to play J.S. Bach's Sonata in G major, BWV 1039, using the methods that I've described here. But we also filled out the harmonies as indicated by the bass figures using idiomatic keyboard figuration that took advantage of the two keyboard idiom. So I don't know if we have time to listen to the whole movement. If we don't, then we can cut off early, but here's at least a little bit of that movement. So just to conclude, musical salon practices presented many practical puzzles. Within salons, musicians might need to sight read, play a part idiomatic to another instrument, or improvise a new line to fit in with an ensemble. Arrangements could be notated, but they might also be created on the spur of the moment. That is, played in an environment in which adaptation was inherent to all musical creativity, and just to suit the specific situation of each salon. Reading from scores and part books might produce two entirely different sets of expectations on the part of players with very different results. In all cases, the conventions of sociable behavior necessitated that these puzzles be met with grace and good humor. Like Franklin's chess player, the salon musician must know how to downplay her own needs to accommodate others. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you. Forgive me. I left myself on mute. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was really just a taste of the fascinating work that you're doing on salons. Can you tell us what's coming up for you in terms of your research and performance?
Yes,
activity?
I actually went down such a deep rabbit hole with that game of Proverbs that I have an article coming out on that. But and it's a little bit about music, but also just sort of about, you know, the way that women played games and were sociable together. And yeah, I'm working with members of my ensemble to develop new programs around women in the late 18th century, some of which are based in salons and others not. Well, you and I have been working on the Mozart 2-piano sonata K448, which Mozart wrote for performance with one of his women students, Josefa Auernhammer, and we're doing that in the fortepiano harpsichord combination. So that's a lot of fun. And I'm working on a project on Angélique Diderot, who was the daughter of the philosophe Denis Diderot, and her musicianship. Hopefully developing a new program on the painter Angelica Kaufmann, who also hosted a salon when she moved to Rome in the 1780s. She had Goethe as one of her guests, and there's just, you know, lots of sort of international connections there. So she was also a very accomplished musician and hosted musical performances in her salon. So there's always more to do, but it's a lot of fun and really fascinating.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be able to work with you on some of these projects and just hear about what you're researching. And, you know, we'll have time for question and answer at the end of the program, and we want to move on soon. But I just want to say that for me as a professional musician working in the 21st century, the way that you talk about salon culture, this sense of playfulness, the way that women were critical part of this social fabric. It really challenges a lot of ideas we have of the archetypical professional musician and what it means to be an accomplished person in music for now, as well as back then, in the most convivial and civil way, to be, almost to quote your Benjamin Franklin quote, a silent approbation of this one idea we have of what it means to make music in a meaningful and high level, that salon culture is something more fluid, and that in the playfulness, there's so much value and creativity that we shouldn't forget about. So thank you.
I think if I could just add one more thought, I think it also really challenges some of the long-held assumptions of the historical performance movement, that we should always be choosing the right instrument for each piece. I think that in terms of usage, you know, and reception history, what was right was always fluid, and people used what they had.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, as we are all, we've all gone through conservatories where we're so earnestly searching for the most right or correct answer in terms of playing music, and it's so refreshing to be able to relax and know, you know, music is a living, fluid practice, and a lot of times it's about adaptivity and creativity in the moment, and being realistic about what you can do in the moment as well, and the great things that come out of that by surprise and serendipity.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we'll have, I'm sure, many questions for you at the end, but it's a great pleasure now to bring on Maria, who will introduce Marcia from.
Yes, and I will. Let's move forward. I mean, I have so much to say about in reaction to Rebecca's paper, which was and presentation, which is really thought-provoking and wonderful. But I don't want to. I'd like to move on to the next part of the program. So I'm really happy to introduce Marcia Hadjimarkos, who I met a very long time ago, and we've been moving in similar worlds, but never quite crossed paths again. And I'm so happy to reconnect with her. I think we were like 30 years ago or something. We were both at the festival of Jos van Emmerseel in Antwerp, and piano. That I know for sure. And you know, and Marcia is originally from the United States, but has spent most of her life in France by now, I assume. And I'm the other way around. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've spent most of my life in the United States. So we've kind of switched over. So Marcia is now in near Cluny in France, where she lives, I think, in an old farmhouse with instruments tucked away here and there. But she's a wonderful fortepianist as well as a clavichord performer, which is really interesting and important. We have at our workshop academy, we have Masayuki Maki, who's a wonderful clavichord player, and he subjects everyone who comes to learn the fortepiano to clavichord practice, because and his latest idea is that for practicing, everybody should have a clavichord in their room to really learn to feel, listen, and create sound that is otherwise, we get too caught up in technical issues. Anyway, so I'm very happy to have Marcia here. And can you tell us a little bit more about where you are? You're near Cluny?
Yes, I live in Burgundy, which is one of the regions of eastern France. So I'm about halfway down west of Geneva, north of Lyon, south of Paris. And I live in a very small village outside of the town of Cluny, where the famous abbey,
yes,
parts of the famous abbey are still standing.
Yes, and is your main center of activity in Paris, or is it more locally? Or?
It's not necessarily in Paris. I'll be in Paris in a couple of weeks, but I don't actually go there all that often, unfortunately, at the moment. I do things locally and in France and internationally.
Right. All right. Well, let's continue to your performance. Is there anything you'd like to say about the first piece that you're going to be performing?
Yes, I have lots of things to say.
Me too.
So the first piece is going to be a piece by Claude Balbâtre, and the name of the piece is La Chanteloup. And we're going to be moving now away from exclusively female salons, but remaining in the private sphere. And in connection with Claude Balbâtre, the composer, I wanted to mention a very interesting and valuable new book that was published by Pierre Dubois, who may be with us this evening, I hope so, from a little further west in France. It's the book about Balbâtre's life and his music, and it was published last year, for the moment only in French, but let's hope that a translation will be made of this very interesting book. The title, as you see, is Un virtuoso au siècle des Lumières, a virtuoso of the Enlightenment, of the French Enlightenment. And it goes into some detail about French musical salons and their importance in Balbâtre's career as a composer and a performer, and also as a host of his own salon in his own home. Balbâtre was an extremely well-known and sought-after musician in 18th century Paris. He played all keyboard instruments, the organ, the harpsichord, the fortepiano, and the organized piano, which we can talk a little bit more about later. And he also improvised, composed, and was a teacher. And the first mention of Balbâtre in musical salons in Pierre Dubois' book refers again to Charles Burney's musical travelogue, which Rebecca also mentioned, The Present State of Music in France and Italy, which he published in 1773. And Burney met Balbâtre when he visited Paris. And Balbâtre then invited Burney to his own home, where a musical salon was in process. And Pierre Dubois emphasizes that Balbâtre was not only an outstanding musician, but he was also a very refined and charming gentleman. He was, on top of that, an attentive and considerate host. All in all, he was un homme ravissant. So this is a word that Rebecca uses in her book, and it crops up quite often in Pierre Dubois' book as well. A ravishing man. It sounds a bit strange in English, but it was a term, I think, that was used quite often in the 18th century to describe this combination of sought-after qualities. It meant that he was able to transport his guests and his listeners through his playing and also through his human qualities into an emotional state that included admiration, joy, and even a kind of ecstasy. And this echoes the social harmony that Rebecca was talking about a few minutes ago during her talk. So here's the quote from Bernie about his visit to Balbâtre. After church, I went home with him to hear and see a fine Rückers harpsichord. He had likewise a very large organ in his house, which was full of company, 12 or 14 ladies, and 10 or a dozen gentlemen. En vérité, in truth, says one of the ladies, vous êtes ravissant. That word again, you are ravishing. And he, that's to say, Balbâtre, played a great deal and soon found out by my talk and approbation that I was a performer, and he pressed me very much to play. As he'd been so obliging himself, I sat down at the harpsichord. French politeness was not wanting, though I had not much partiality to myself. However, this was a useful and agreeable visit. So that's Bernie and Balbâtre at home, Balbâtre's home in his own salon in Paris. And Balbâtre was also associated very closely with the musical salon at the Chateau of Chanteloup, if we could have the image of this extraordinary place, which is in the Loire River Valley. The chateau itself is no longer standing. The gardens are still partially in existence, but the actual building, which, as you can see, rivaled Versailles in terms of size and elegance, and the beauty of its gardens is no longer with us. And this Chateau of Chanteloup was the home of the Duke and Duchess of Choiseul, who hired Balbâtre. He was one of their musicians periodically, and he performed for them and their guests. And he was also the harpsichord teacher of the Duchess of Choiseul. And he brought one of his own instruments to the chateau, which was an organized piano. This is a combination instrument like the vis-a-vis piano that, combination piano and harpsichord that Rebecca showed us a few moments ago. And in this case, it included a piano action and organ pipes in the same case. So you could choose to play one or the other instrument or both sounding at the same time, but it was for just one player. And Balbâtre played this organized piano on many occasions at Chanteloup for, in quotations, persons of distinction. His 4 suites of Noëls, these are simple Christmas songs with added variations that today are most often played on the organ, but can be played, as Rebecca mentioned, on any keyboard instrument. They're dedicated to the Duchess of Choiseul. And here's a passage that describes plans for a Christmas Eve gathering in the chateau. It goes like this. Balbâtre, the famous harpsichord player, will bring his pianoforte and he will play his Noëls and other pieces on it during our supper. Most of these were composed at Chanteloup. And now if we can see the portrait of the Duchess of Choiseul, here she is. Possibly, it looks like she's holding a book. I'm not sure if it's a musical score, but it seems to be some sort of publication. And this was painted by a female artist called Anna Dorothea Terbusch. And I'd like to read another description of music making that took place at Chanteloup. The chateau had a small permanent orchestra. The Duke had 6 musicians, and he and the Duchess also played the organized piano. A room near the sitting room was dedicated to music, and every day from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, a symphony of the best and the newest sort was played. This is my free translation. The Duke had also engaged a renowned composer, Claude Balbâtre, who gave the Duchess harpsichord lessons and performed on the fortepiano or the harpsichord before the guests. So the piece that you're going to be hearing in just a moment is called La Chanteloup. This is the name of the chateau where the Duke and Duchess lived. We saw the picture a couple of minutes ago. And it's part of a collection of pieces that Balbâtre wrote for the organized piano. And it's closely associated with the time that he spent there with his own instrument. And the piece La Chanteloup is in the tradition of the character piece or the musical portrait, like those written by François Couperin or C.P. Ibach. But in this case, it's portraying a place, in this case, the chateau and what occurred there rather than a person. So we can go on to the So now you've had a chance to hear this square piano built by Johannes Betz in Frankfurt in the year 1789 and restored in the early 90s by Christopher Clark. I played it in this selection with the lid down, but one can also, of course, put the lid up, and there's a little flap that can also be opened or closed when the lid is down. And there are 4 knee levers underneath the keyboard rather than pedals. And so with these 7 different possibilities, there are 127 combinations that are possible. I don't know if I found them all, but I'm working on it. So there's lots of different things that you can do to change the sounds of this piano and for expressive purposes. What can I tell you about the piano? Maybe I can tell you what I did in the first video, rather. In the A section, I raised the treble dampers only. And maybe we could have the first picture, the first photo, if that's possible. There you go. Okay, so this is looking underneath the instrument. You see the 4 knee levers. And what's interesting on this piano is that the pedals are divided into 2 parts, or the keyboard is divided into 2 parts at middle C. And the 2 pedals that you see inside, the 2 in the middle, correspond to, on the left, the bass half of the instrument from the bottom F up to middle C, and the one next to it on the right, from middle C up to the top F. So you can choose which half of the keyboard you liberate by lifting the dampers so that that half of the keyboard can resonate. Of course, you can press both knees at the same time and let the entire keyboard resonate. And on the outside, you have 2 further knee levers, which you have to spread your knees a bit to reach. And those correspond to the 2 halves of the harp stop, bass on the left and treble on the right. So you can also, you can of course choose what you want to do. There are very, very few indications in the music that give you any clues about how you can use these pedals. I think it's very much up to the player in the moment, or maybe with a bit of advanced planning. So if you want, and you've got wide knees, you can press all 4 at the same time. So you can have the harp stop, and at the same time you can liberate all the strings. So let's have the next picture if we could. Okay, so here you see the keyboard. You can see the very pretty marquetry, and you can see these 4 pedals, which are just underneath the keyboard. And the picture was taken with the legs off the instrument. It's in the workshop having its strings changed. So let's go on to the next one, please. And here you see the dampers of the instrument, and you see on the right, you can see the little flap is up, and that's one of the flaps that actually goes down, pressing down this black band of felt against the strings to produce the harp stop. The dampers were all replaced on this instrument because none of them existed. So they were all rebuilt during the restoration, or not rebuilt, but built during the restoration. If we can go on now to the next one. And here you see a little bit closer the dampers in the bass, and then maybe the last one. Okay, and here you see looking at towards the treble, you can see not only the dampers, but also underneath you can see the hammers, the little white heads, sort of towards the middle of the strings. And the hammers are original. The hammer coverings also are original. The leather was changed only on about 2 or 3 of the hammer heads, and you can see that they're absolutely minuscule, very, very, very tiny. And there are no dampers for the last 2 notes in the treble. So maybe if there are questions during the audience participation time, if there are questions about the instrument, I'd be happy to answer them. And maybe we should go on now to the second video, which is sonata movement by the French female composer Madame de Villeblanche, and she wrote 4 sonatas. This is an excerpt from the first one. It's the second movement of the first sonata in C minor, and the indication is andante. And now I'll be playing again with the lid down, and I'll be at one point closing the flap to make the instrument sound even more sort of pure and concentrated, rather than having the big wash of sound that you get when you do open the lid. And one thing I'd like to mention is that I had the music desk added for when the instrument is open. There was no music desk in the original instrument, so that meant probably that it was played with the lid down. So let's go on to the second video. So I'd like to continue by saying a few words about this composer, Madame de Villeblanche. We know very, very little about her. We don't know her birth date or her birth year. We don't know her first name. We don't know her maiden name. We only know her married name. And there is no information about where she may have played these sonatas or other pieces in a salon, either her own or in another setting, another salon setting. Her husband published these pieces after her death at the very early age of 24. And he refers in his preface to the sonatas to the virtuosos who knew her, which is quite intriguing, a kind of hint about musicians that she may have known or played for or with. A set of sonatas was dedicated to her by Hullmandel in 1782, so we can deduce that she was alive at that time and that she died the same year, 1782 or later. The original score was published in Paris, and it's available free of charge on the Bibliothèque Nationale site. And a modern edition was prepared by Calvin Johnson and published by the Vivace Press. So Madame de Villeblanche's husband published her 4 sonatas. They were entitled Quatre sonates pour le pianoforte ou le clavecin, so 4 sonatas for the fortepiano or the harpsichord. And he dedicated them to her. And in his introduction, he says, "She is no more. When she was barely 24 years old, death with a single blow struck down the author of these charming works, and the most uncommon mixture of graces, virtues, kindness, and every talent. The music lovers, and especially the virtuosos who knew her, will find some charms here by which to remember her as they perform these works. In placing her name as the dedicatee at the beginning of this volume, I transmit her talents to posterity, and I immortalize my own sorrow." So we'll go on to the third and final video, which is the first movement of the sonata in C minor, and it's the Allegro, and this time we will play with the lid open to give you an idea of how the piano sounds this way. We can have the third video.
Thank you, Marcia. That was wonderful, and the piano is incredibly interesting. Somebody asked about the whether the split pedals might indicate forehand playing for two pianists.
Definitely.
And I remember Ehang and I played a forehand piece on a well, it was a very different piano, but it had four pedals, but it also had a knee lever, and it was as if it was for the left player to control, because the raising of the dampers was very far to the right, so you'd have to really cross over somebody's legs to raise the dampers. So there was another knee lever at the left, maybe to accommodate the second player. So. Anyway, this both of you were really, and I'm so glad we had both of you, because you were both really in tandem, it seemed with on the topic and the type of music, and it was just a wonderful combination. I would like to share one quote that I found, that because I'm always thinking about what the social life was like at the time. I mean, even from pre-television, I remember my grandparents always playing games in the evening. I mean, that was just, what you did, because what else do you do? And well, two things. One of them was that in the quote from I think it was Benjamin Franklin, who said that I don't go to the opera. But what that means is everybody else did. And because the opera, you feel like the experience of going to the opera is at the bottom of so much of this music, of evoking. You can't play the recording of it when you come home. You have to recreate it. And a lot of the music, I even wonder, the Madame de Villeblanche, it sounds very orchestral and many ways. And I know the Edelman, the composer Jean-François Edelman, who was died on the guillotine, I believe, one of the unfortunate people of that time. He wrote a lot of music that was very orchestral, and so it was like they came home and they wanted to create a lot of this music. But the quote, I just came across it earlier today, and I thought it really tells us something about the social life of the time. And this is in the Encyclopédie Méthodique of 1791, under the heading of chanson. And it said that every well-bred person urged at the table to pay tribute to the continuing custom would have thought to be ill-mannered if he had not regaled his guests with the most tender and often mournful air or song. So, I mean, it was part of the conversation. You made music, everybody had a song, everybody had, was ready to, and also it also reminds me of the very not women-oriented society, Le Caveau, where the whole purpose of men getting together was, well, first of all, to eat very well and to drink, and to also make up verses on the spot and set them to music, and just to a melody. And so that was an art form of playing with words and music and having them be part of the competition. That it's really hard for us to imagine now, that the ease with which they did that. Anyway, so these are some of the...
Would it be okay? I saw there was a little bit of an exchange in the chat asking what is a salon, and there were a couple of texts about that. Is it okay if I just respond to that question?
Yeah, you want to go back to that one? Sure.
Yeah, because I think it's actually a very complicated question, right? The word salon in the 18th century referred to a room, a parlor, a very fancy and large living room. But the in the 18th century, the institution of the salon, where people would gather on a regular basis, like weekly or twice a week or once a month, in order to share music and conversation and good food, and there was often a woman at the center, that could be called something different in every language and every locale. But these practices did exist. They had a particular character in Paris, but there were versions of salons in London and elsewhere in Britain, in Rome and other Italian cities, in Berlin and Vienna. Even before the French model of the salon arrived there in the 1780s, Vienna had a culture of female-hosted academien, or academies, they would call them, where they would share music in the home. And it's true that there were all men's clubs, but I do think that those are somewhat different. And I kind of to insist on the female-dominated space, because women were so often excluded from institutions of the public sphere. They were excluded from receiving a formal education, right? They couldn't attend universities. They really only got a little bit of tutoring at home, even the wealthiest women. So what that meant was that these women who were privileged to host a salon used those that institution, those gatherings with amateurs and other members of the aristocracy or the sort of aspirational upper classes, and also with professional musicians and artists, to gain an education, to talk to people about what's happening in the public sphere, what are the latest publications that they should be reading, what's happening in politics, but also to let their own ideas seep out into the public sphere through their guests. So there's I just wanted to chime in with that.
I'm sorry, I had to mute myself because the children are coming. You saw my daughter there joining us for a moment. Rebecca has a wonderful book which goes into detail about all of these salons. I highly recommend Women in Musical Salons in the Enlightenment. And Rebecca, aren't you working on editing another book about salons? Or is that public information?
So the salon was an institution that even persists today. There was a sort of high point in the 19th century when it had a very different character from 18th century salons, but in the United States in the 20th century, right, and all over Europe, Latin America, even some in North Africa, there were salons. And just today I have a chapter in that book that sort of surveys the history of women in musical salons, a chapter on a Philadelphia salonier today, who during COVID changed her medium to Zoom, and she called them Zoom salons, or salons. So her name is Andrea Clearfield. She's a composer, a pianist, and she hosts these things regularly. They're sort of hybrid international events now. It's very interesting how the institution keeps morphing depending on technologies, I guess, and other circumstances.
Yeah. This very Fortepiano salon we're in right now came also out of a necessity during the pandemic for musical people to connect. We have another question. This probably will be our last, from Nathan Mondry. Hello, Nathan. He was one of our guests in the fall. Wonderful historical improviser in Ithaca, New York. Nathan asks, and perhaps Marcia can answer for us, might square pianos with 4 knee levers, which you showed us, or any keyboard with divided register possibilities hint at particular suitability for 4-hand music?
Yeah, I think definitely, as we mentioned earlier, I think it makes life much easier when you're playing 4 hands to be able to control the damper raising mechanism on your half of the keyboard. Definitely, it's a big plus, and not having to reach across somebody's foot or leg to get to reach the damper pedal. So absolutely, yes.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for sharing your performances on your beautiful square piano.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Where we could hear all those wonderful effects with the flap open and closed, and the moderator effect.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe Rebecca's interested in translating the book about Babette.
I don't know if I'm the right person for that job, though. It
Yeah.
definitely should be
I
translated.
know. Well, somebody has to. I know most. I mean, I've looked at some of his music, but I'm always really intrigued. I'm sure you've run into that too. The romance that he wrote that is on the in the special notation.
Mhm.
En grammaire.
With Angramel.
En grammaire. Yeah, which indicates with little dots the exact length of the notes, not just when they're played, but also how long and all the decorations. And it's an amazing document for performance practice.
Yes, and to compare that score with the unornamented version, it's hard to believe he fit all those little notes in.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable, and it makes us think about what we do with music. I mean, it's like a recording, really. It's like
well, it was recorded. I think he
yeah,
actually
it was
recording
recorded by hand on the yeah. So and anybody who wants to know more about that. So and I mean, our next salon in March is going to be on many of the same in a way about the same topic of domestic music making, because the accompanied keyboard sonata really is kind of a salon genre that anyway it's so I hope people who are interested in this topic will come back in March.
So
thank
yeah,
you.
perhaps that's a good segue to concluding and thanking our wonderful guests, Marcia Hadjimarkos in France and Rebecca Cypus in New Jersey at Rutgers University. Thank you so much for everything that you shared with us. You're both wonderful artists at early music. So it's been a great honor to spend time with you. And our upcoming salon, as Maria just said, will be on March 25th. Correct?
Right.
Yes. And stay tuned for all the details on the website.
On the Saturday at 2:00. And
yes.
if I will be playing with my friend Antonia and some of the repertoire of the accompanied keyboard sonata on March 4 in Hunter for those of you who live in the area. So please stay tuned for that.
Wonderful. Yeah. You can find lots of information and stay updated by joining our mailing list. You can visit www.academyfortepiano.org. And please join us for our next salon. Thank you again to our guests.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.